Senate mocked, until humans departed without a sound. The laughter started before I even sat down. I heard it as I stepped through the main corridor leading into the Grand Senate of the Galactic Concord. A sound like water rushing over gravel, layered and strange, coming from 30 different mouths shaped by 30 different evolutionary paths. I did not know what was funny. I found out later. A HFY senator, one of the senior bloc members, had told the chamber that the human observer had arrived and had gotten lost twice in the building. He said it the way adults talk about a child who cannot find the bathroom in a new house. Charming, helpless, temporary. My name is Soren Aldridge. I was 29 years old, junior diplomatic attaché for the Human Concord Liaison Office, and I was, at that moment, the only human being inside the largest governing chamber in explored space. My chair was too short. The armrests were built for limbs with an extra joint. The name placard on the desk in front of me still said Vorith, which was the name of a species that had been extinct for 400 years. Nobody had replaced it. Nobody had thought to. I sat down, straightened my jacket, and looked out at the chamber. It was enormous, in a way that photographs never captured. The Concord had been building this structure for 10,000 years, adding to it each time a new species joined, expanding the floor space, raising the ceiling, adding new tiers of seating that curved upward and inward like the inside of a shell. The walls were covered in a kind of living mineral the Varel had contributed. It breathed slowly, cycling through deep purples and greens, in a rhythm that matched no clock I could identify. The delegates sat in curved rows, hundreds of them, each at a desk fitted precisely to their body type. The acoustics were perfect. Every voice carried. Mine would not be heard today. Mine would not be heard for a very long time. Associate members did not have floor time. We did not vote. We did not propose motions or sit on committees or introduce resolutions. We sat in the observation gallery, except I had been placed on the main floor, which was a minor diplomatic courtesy, the kind that costs nothing and means nothing, and we watched. I opened my personal log and began to write. The session was about trade route realignment in the outer meridian. 3 species had competing claims to a series of relay beacons, and the argument had been going on for 11 years. I listened carefully. Not because the outcome concerned humanity directly. We had no beacons in that sector, no shipping interests, no political stake. I listened because I had been told to listen. My assignment was simple: observe, document, and report. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not make commitments. Do not draw attention. The HFY senator who had made the joke about me getting lost stood to speak. His name was Vel Orath, and he was apparently famous for his humor. The chamber liked him. He had a way of making complex political arguments feel light, almost casual, and other delegates leaned forward when he spoke. He was tall, with a triangular face and 4 narrow eyes arranged in a slight arc, and he moved his hands when he talked in a way that reminded me, oddly, of a conductor. He said something in the middle of his speech about the trade route dispute that made the chamber ripple again with that layered sound. I caught the translation through my earpiece half a second later. He had said, "Even the carbon curiosities from the third arm seem to understand that territory must be earned, not inherited, though I imagine they are still learning what territory means." Carbon curiosities. That was us. Humanity. 1.4 trillion people across 12 colonies, and 1 homeworld. 300 years of spaceflight, 200 years of interstellar travel, and we were carbon curiosities. I wrote it down in my log, word for word. I had been writing things down word for word since my first day on the station, not because I was angry, not because I planned to use it as evidence of some insult. I wrote it down because data is data, and I had been raised by a woman who said the same thing every time she sat down at her desk. Write down what people show you, not what they tell you, what they show you. My mother's name was Claire Aldridge. She had been a structural engineer on the first human deep space relay station, and she had a habit of keeping 3 notebooks at a time, one for technical specs, one for personal observations, and one for what she called the things people think they're hiding. She was the most patient person I had ever known, and she had taught me that patience is not the same as passivity. Patience is what you practice while you are doing something that takes a long time. I had been practicing patience for 3 years in this chamber. So had every human diplomat before me. The session ended 4 hours later. I stood, gathered my things, and walked back toward the Human Liaison Office, a two-room suite near the Eastern Service Corridor, between the maintenance access bay and a storage room for Virel ceremonial banners. It was not a prestigious location. It had no window. The cleaning staff came twice a week instead of daily, because someone in building management had classified our office as auxiliary. I did not complain about any of this. I had been specifically told not to. On the corridor wall outside our office, someone had posted a Senate floor map. It was updated monthly, color-coded by species block. The human section was marked in gray, a pale, unobtrusive gray, the color of something that had not yet been assigned a real color. I stopped in front of it for a moment, looking at where our gray sat among the bright blues and reds and golds of the other species. Then I pulled out my personal communicator and checked the encrypted channel I monitored every morning. There was a message from Director Colin Marsh back on Earth. It was short. It said, "Phase 1 complete. Continue observation. Do not vary from protocol." I read it twice, put the communicator away, and went inside. My colleague, a woman named Dara Lowe, was sitting at the secondary desk reviewing transit logs. She was 5 years older than me, had been in this posting for 2 years before I arrived, and she had a particular quality I had always respected. She never filled silence with noise. She looked up when I came in, read my face, and nodded slightly. "The Orath joke?" she said. "Carbon curiosities," I said. She turned back to her screen. "Add it to the file." I sat down at my own desk and pulled up the file. It was long. It went back 7 years, through 4 different human liaisons. Every joke, every dismissal, every vote cast against human interests, every procedural slight, every moment when a senator had spoken over a human representative, or talked around them as though they were not in the room. It was all there, cataloged, dated, cross-referenced. None of it had ever been submitted as a formal complaint. We had been told not to submit formal complaints. A complaint requires the other party to notice you. Director Marsh, from the very beginning, had been clear about the strategy. He said it the first time I met him, in a small conference room in Nairobi, 6 months before I shipped out. He said it the way people say things that sound simple, but take years to fully understand. "Let them think we're thin-skinned and fragile," he said. "Let them think every joke lands. People who believe they have the upper hand stop paying attention to what you're building." I had not fully understood it then. I understood it better now. I opened a new section of the observation log and began writing up the day's session. Outside, through the thin walls of the corridor, I could hear the ambient sounds of Concord Station, the movement of hundreds of species, the hum of environmental systems calibrated to 17 different atmospheric preferences, the distant sound of something large being transported through the freight corridor 2 levels below. I wrote for 2 hours. Then I stopped, stretched, and looked at the desk across from mine. Dara was still working, quiet and steady, the way she always was. "They voted today to table the route resolution for another year," I said. "I know," she said. "That means the relay beacons in the outer meridian stay contested. Traffic reroutes through the secondary corridor." "I know," she said again. And then, after a pause, "Our contract with the Vorith Freight Cooperative covers 3 of the 7 relay points in that corridor. If traffic increases by the projected 17%, we're looking at a significant volume jump." She said it the same way she said everything, quietly, matter-of-factly, without emphasis, as though it were simply information. I looked at her. She was still looking at her screen. "Our contract," I said, "which is operated under the Aldgate shipping license, which is registered on Kepler Station," she said, "which is not inside Concord jurisdiction. So the Senate just inadvertently directed more traffic through a corridor where a human-owned company holds the primary relay contracts." "Third time in 4 years," she said. I sat back in my chair. The Senate had 37 member species, a 10,000-year history, and the most sophisticated diplomatic apparatus in the galaxy. And they had, 3 times in 4 years, made decisions that quietly benefited human infrastructure, not because they were generous, but because they were not paying attention to what we had been building while they were busy finding us amusing. I looked at the Vorith nameplate on my desk. I thought about leaving it there. Then I thought about what it represented. A species that was gone. A species that had sat in this gallery once, and had never been remembered clearly enough for anyone to bother updating a sign. I did not want that for us. Not the erasure, not the forgetting. But I also was not here to demand that anyone write our name correctly. I was here to make sure that, by the time anyone thought to change the sign, the name would matter so much it could not be ignored. I closed my log. The station lights had shifted into their evening cycle, a pale amber that mimicked a sunset, chosen by some long-ago committee as the universal signal for the end of the working day. I stood up, walked to the door, and looked back at the two-room office, the cramped desks, the wall with no window. Then I turned off the light and went to dinner. Tomorrow the Senate would convene again. They would argue and posture and vote and ignore us. And I would write it all down. 3 weeks after that first session, I found out that Vel Orath had made the carbon curiosities remark 14 times before. Not the same joke. He recycled the phrase but changed the context, dropping it into different debates like a signature. Someone in the Kethal press corps had documented it. He was apparently considered charming for it. There was a short piece in the Concord Cultural Review that described him as a senator with a dry wit and a talent for levity. I added the article to the file. That same week, the Senate's Commerce Oversight Committee met to review membership tier classifications. It was a routine session. These reviews happened every 5 years, and they were mostly administrative. But this one had a supplementary item added to the agenda by the Varel delegation. I read it in the pre-session brief that Dara placed on my desk every morning before I arrived. She always arrived 40 minutes before I did, and always had the briefs sorted, annotated, and flagged by relevance. The supplementary item proposed a reclassification of human membership status from associate to observer. The difference, in plain terms, was this. Associate members had a physical presence on the Senate floor. Observer status meant a seat in the gallery, behind glass, with a 48-hour delay on receiving session transcripts. It was not, technically, a downgrade. The official language called it a structural alignment for chamber coherence. I read it twice. Then I picked up my communicator and sent a single word to Director Marsh. Noted. His reply came 6 minutes later. Continue protocol. Do not respond publicly. I set the communicator down and went to make tea. The tea was from Earth, a simple black blend that my mother had always kept in the kitchen. I had brought 40 packets when I shipped out and had been rationing them carefully. I sat with the cup and looked out at the corridor, which was busy at this hour with the morning rush of Senate staff moving between offices. I had been thinking, for several weeks, about a particular set of numbers. During my first year in the posting, I had been given access, as all liaison staff were, to the Concord's Public Infrastructure Registry. It was a massive database that tracked every registered contractor, service provider, and maintenance operator working anywhere within Concord jurisdiction. The access was meant to be a resource for coordination, so that human liaison staff could navigate the station's systems. Nobody had told me not to read all of it. I had spent 7 months going through the registry, section by section, in the evenings after the Senate sessions ended. Dara had noticed, asked once what I was doing, and when I explained, she had simply nodded and started helping. What we found was not a surprise exactly, but it was significant. Human-registered companies, human-trained contractors, human-built systems, they were everywhere in the registry. Not dominant, not obvious, but woven through in a way that, once you looked for it, you could not stop seeing. A Thanari medical station running diagnostic software built by a company called Verity Systems, which had an address on Luna and a staff of 42 engineers. A Merchant Guild cargo hub using freight management protocols developed by an outfit called Blue Water Logistics, registered on New Auckland. A Kethal communications relay that had been upgraded 6 years ago by a maintenance team sourced from a human contractor consortium who had left behind a proprietary interface layer that was, by now, deeply embedded in the relay's core architecture. None of these companies were famous. None of them had Senate representatives or political influence. They had won their contracts the ordinary way, by being reliable, affordable, and very good at doing what they said they would do, and then they had moved on to the next contract. The thing about infrastructure is that it becomes invisible when it works. Nobody thinks about the pipes until the water stops. Dara and I had mapped it all out over those 7 months. Not every connection. That would have taken years. But enough. Enough to understand the shape of it, the way humanity had embedded itself into the practical machinery of the Concorde without anyone making a deliberate plan to do so. It had happened naturally, driven by simple economics and human competitiveness, the same way water finds the low points in any landscape. We sent our findings to Director Marsh in a report we called, without irony, the Infrastructure Survey. He read it, confirmed receipt, and sent back a 3-word reply. Good. Keep going. The reclassification vote happened on a Tuesday. I sat on the main floor for the last time that day, in the chair that was always too short, next to the placard that still said Vorith. The session was sparsely attended for a chamber of its size. Most delegates sent junior staff for procedural votes like this one. Vel Orath was there, though, seated in the primary Kethal position, looking comfortable. He caught my eye once across the chamber floor and gave a small, polite nod. I nodded back. The vote was called. The result came through the board in segments, species by species. 29 in favor of reclassification, 6 opposed, 2 abstentions. Motion carried. I was now an observer. In 48 hours, I would be moved from the main floor to the gallery above it. I would receive transcripts with a delay. I would have no desk, no placard, not even a wrong one. I wrote the result down in my log. Then I noted the time, the exact composition of the vote, and the names of the 6 species who had opposed it. They were smaller blocks, mostly, species without significant political weight. But they had voted correctly, and I thought they deserved to be remembered. I did not note how I felt about it. That was not what the log was for. After the session, I walked back to the liaison office for the last time, as a floor-level staff member. Dara was already there. She had heard the result through the session feed. She had also, I noticed, begun packing the secondary desk in preparation for our move to the smaller observation office upstairs. They made it official, I said. They made it easier, she said, and continued packing. I thought about that for a moment. Then I sat down and opened my communicator. There was already a message waiting, sent from Earth 3 hours ago, which meant it had been prepared before the vote was even held. Director Marsh's message was longer this time. It laid out the next phase of what he was calling the withdrawal protocol. Not a dramatic withdrawal, not an announced departure, not a political statement. A systematic, quiet, methodical reduction of human presence across every node where we had a footprint, carried out according to a schedule that had apparently been in preparation for 2 years. The document attached to the message was detailed and precise. It covered 63 different operations, across 41 locations, on 18 different stations and outposts within Concorde jurisdiction. Each one had a target date, a responsible team lead, and a protocol for filing the standard end-of-contract paperwork in the correct administrative format. Everything would be done correctly, every I dotted, every T crossed. We would not make a scene. We would not write an angry letter. We would not hold a press conference or leak documents or seek allies among the opposition blocs. We would simply complete our contracts, file our notices, hand over what could be handed over, and leave. I scrolled through the document slowly, reading each entry. Blue Water Logistics. Notice of service termination to be filed 30 days before contract expiration. Standard format, no supplementary remarks. Verity Systems. End of contract handover protocol to begin 90 days prior to departure. Documentation to be provided in the Concorde's preferred archival format. I kept reading. By the time I reached the end, the station lights had shifted to evening amber. I looked up at Dara. She was sitting very still, reading her own copy of the document on her screen. How long have you known? I asked. 16 months, she said. And you didn't tell me. You didn't need to know until now. Now you need to know. I put down the communicator. I looked at the wall with no window, the 2 cramped desks, the space that had never been given enough room to feel like it belonged. When do we file our own notice? I asked. 14 days, she said. And then? And then we pack. We say goodbye to no one in particular, and we leave. She finally looked away from her screen. Her expression was calm. We don't announce it, Soren. We don't explain it. We don't ask them to reconsider. We just go. I nodded slowly. Outside in the corridor, The station was doing what it always did at this hour, settling into its evening rhythm, the noise of the day dropping to a quieter hum. Somewhere in the levels above us, the Senate was probably hosting one of its nightly receptions, the kind where delegates mixed socially and alliances were maintained over food that no single species could fully digest. Vel Orath was probably there, probably charming, probably very pleased with how the day had gone. I thought about what it would feel like when our transit licenses stopped being renewed, when the maintenance calls to human contractors started bouncing back as unavailable, when the freight corridor reports started showing gaps where our shipping lanes used to run. I thought about the Thanari Medical Station and its Verity Systems diagnostic software. I thought about the license renewal date attached to that system in the registry database. It was in 11 months. I opened my log and wrote the date down. Not as a threat, not as a plan, just as a fact. Facts, my mother always said, do their own work. You just have to be patient enough to let them. I closed the log, stood up, and stretched. I am going to get dinner, I told Dara. Bring something back, she said, already back to her screen. I walked out into the amber-lit corridor, past the Senate floor map with its pale gray human section, past the maintenance bay, past the storage room full of Varel banners. I walked through the station the way I always did, quietly, without drawing attention, taking in everything around me with the steady, unhurried focus of someone who understood that the most important things in any room are almost never the things people are looking at. 14 days, then we would go. And the Senate, I was quite certain, would not notice for a very long time. The morning I filed our departure notice was ordinary in every visible way. I woke at 6, made the second to last of my tea packets, and sat at the small desk in my quarters reviewing the documents one final time. The forms were standard Concord administrative paperwork, the same forms that any contractor, diplomat, or station employee used when ending their engagement. 3 pages each, signature at the bottom. A mandatory 14-day processing period before the departure was logged in the official registry. I filled them out carefully. I did not rush. Dara had already submitted her own forms the evening before. She had not mentioned it. I only knew because I received an automatic notification as the senior liaison on record, a system-generated message, the kind that nobody at Senate level would ever read, because it came through the administrative subchannel reserved for staff departures and supply requisitions. Nobody at Senate level monitored the administrative subchannel. I signed the forms, submitted them through the correct portal, and received a confirmation number. Then I began packing. It did not take long. 3 years of life in a 2-room office, and a crew quarters the size of a generous closet, does not accumulate much. My books were digital. My personal items fit into a single bag. I left the water kettle. It had come with the quarters and belonged to the station. I left the desk calendar that still showed the wrong month because I had stopped caring about correcting it. I left a small framed photograph of my mother standing on the observation deck of the relay station where she had worked, which I had kept on the desk not for sentiment, but because it grounded me whenever I looked at it, and I no longer needed grounding in the same way. I kept the tea. The last packet. That came with me. The process of human departure from Concord Station was not a single event. It was a quiet tide. I was one of 7 human staff on the station. Over the following 9 days, we left one by one, on separate shuttles, at different times of day. No convoy, no visible coordination. Elin Marsh, no relation to the director, left on day 3, filed on the administrative subchannel, gone before lunch. Owen Garrett, who had worked logistics coordination in the freight hub for 5 years, left on day 5. By day 7, it was only me and a tech specialist named Paul Cray, who was finishing a handover document for the station's secondary water recycling monitor, a system his company had installed 2 years ago on a maintenance contract that expired at the end of the month. Paul was not a diplomat. He was a quiet man in his mid-40s, who had spent most of his career doing infrastructure work in places people rarely thought about. We shared a meal on his last night, in the small human staff canteen, that was now entirely empty except for us. "Do you think they'll notice when we go?" he asked. "Not right away," I said. "How long?" I thought about the 11 months until the Verity Systems license renewal. I thought about the freight corridor reports that would start showing gaps within 4 weeks. I thought about the Blue Water Logistics shutdown, which had a 90-day notice period already filed, which meant service on 3 outer meridian relay points would begin degrading in just over 3 months. Some of it will take days, I said. And some of it will take months. Paul nodded, ate quietly for a moment, and then said, "My dad worked the mines on Titan. Nobody thought that job mattered either, until the power grid started failing." I looked at him. He shrugged. "People only understand what things are worth when they stop being there," he said. He left the next morning. I watched the shuttle dock from the corridor window, a habit I had developed over 3 years, of watching ships come and go from Concord Station. Then I turned and walked back toward the liaison office, which was empty now, its desks cleared, its screens dark. I sat in the chair one last time. My shuttle was in 6 hours. I had nothing left to do except wait, which is something I had always been good at. I opened my communicator and reviewed the monitoring feeds that Director Marsh had given me access to. Open channel Concord Communications, public commercial traffic data, and the administrative subchannel that still nobody at Senate level read. The commercial traffic data was already showing the first small ripples. The freight corridor that Blue Water Logistics serviced had seen a 12% drop in confirmed carrier bookings in the past 10 days, which was still within normal variance. Nobody would be alarmed by it yet, but it was there. I also checked the Senate's own public scheduling system, which was openly accessible to anyone on the station network. The next session was tomorrow morning. The agenda included a resolution on outer meridian trade routes, the same long-running dispute that had been going on for 11 years, now in its 3rd restructuring phase. There was also a social function listed for tomorrow evening, a reception in the main hall to mark the Kethal Block's annual Culture Week. I thought about Velorath at that reception, easy and charming, saying something clever, in a room full of people who liked him. I did not feel angry about it. Anger is loud. Loud things announce themselves. I had spent 3 years learning to be a different kind of thing, the kind that does its work without announcement, that moves through spaces without drawing the eye, that is recognized only in its absence. I wrote a final entry in my log. It was not dramatic. It did not summarize everything I had observed or express a grand conclusion. I simply noted the date, the time of my departure, the confirmation number for my exit forms, and a single line that I had been turning over in my mind for several weeks. The ones who are laughed at are rarely the ones who are watched. This is either their weakness or their advantage. It depends entirely on what they do while nobody is looking. Then I closed the log, stood up, and left the office. I did not look back. There was no ceremony in it. I walked down the corridor past the Senate floor map with its pale gray section, and I noticed that someone had finally updated the map. The human section was gone entirely, not replaced, just removed. The space where it had been was now covered by a slight expansion of the Varel territory marker. I stopped for 3 seconds and looked at that empty space. Then I walked on. I took the long route to the shuttle bay, through the public concourse, past the Senate entrance, past the grand reception hall where species mingled and alliances were maintained. I passed a group of Kethal staff moving supplies for tomorrow's Culture Week function. I passed 2 Thanari delegates in conversation, gesturing to something on a data pad. Nobody looked at me. Nobody noted my passing. I reached the shuttle bay. Paul's departure had been the previous shuttle, which meant the bay was quiet now, staffed by a single operator running through pre-departure checks. She was Varel, young, and she looked up when I approached and checked my credentials with the efficient, impersonal courtesy that station staff used for everyone. "Departure in 40 minutes, she said. "Thank you," I said. I sat in the waiting area and looked out through the bay window at the stars. From here, deep in the station's interior, you could see a narrow strip of space between 2 structural beams, just a slice of darkness, and within it, very faint, the light of distant systems. Somewhere out there was the human fleet, not a military fleet. That framing was always a mistake. A civilian fleet. Freighters and survey ships and long-range transports and private vessels, hundreds of them, repositioning quietly to coordinates outside Concord jurisdiction over the past 6 weeks, the way a tide pulls back from shore before anyone thinks to worry about where the water went. My shuttle boarded. I found my seat, placed my bag in the compartment above, and settled in. The shuttle released from the dock without ceremony. The station fell behind us, growing smaller, then smaller still, then becoming a point of light among other points of light, indistinguishable from a distance. On the open channel monitor built into the seat display, I could see the Concorde commercial traffic data scrolling in real time. It was quiet, normal even. I watched it for a long time as we accelerated away. I was thinking about 11 months, about license renewal dates, about freight corridors and diagnostic software and water recycling monitors, and the hundreds of small, unremarkable, essential things that human hands had built into the bones of a civilization that had never thought to wonder who was holding the tools. They would figure it out. They always did, eventually. The question was what they would say when they did, and what we would say back. I leaned my head against the window and watched the stars. The Senate was behind me now, getting further away with every second. I did not miss it, but I was glad I had been there. I had learned a great deal in that too small chair, at that wrong name placard, in that two-room office with no window. I had learned that being underestimated is only a disadvantage if you believe it. I had learned that the work done in quiet corners outlasts the speeches made from center stages. And I had learned that sometimes the most powerful statement a person can make is the one they do not make at all. The empty chair, the dark office, the corridor with no footsteps. We had left without a sound. Now we would wait and see who noticed first. The first message came on day 11. I was sitting in my temporary quarters on the Horizon 7, a human deep-range survey vessel that Director Marsh had designated as the primary coordination point for what he was now calling the quiet period. The ship held 42 people, a mix of diplomatic staff, analysts, and communications specialists. It was not a large vessel, and quarters were shared, but it was clean and efficient, and nobody complained. We were positioned 420 million kilometers outside the nearest Concorde jurisdiction boundary, close enough to monitor their communication channels, far enough to be, officially, elsewhere. My quarters were a bunk and a desk. I had set up the desk to run 3 monitoring feeds simultaneously, open Concorde broadcast channels, commercial traffic reports from the public registry, and the administrative sub-channel, which I had been watching not because I expected anything useful from it but because of habit. On day 11, it was not the administrative sub-channel that lit up first. It was the commercial feed. A Kethal medical frigate operating in the mid-corridor zone broadcast a general assistance request. The request was not labeled as an emergency. It came through on the standard maintenance frequency, which is what vessels use when something has gone wrong but nobody is in immediate danger. The content of the request was unusual. The frigate's pharmacological synthesizer, the machine that produced a range of critical compounds on demand, had entered a locked maintenance state. The vessel's engineering staff had been trying to reset it for 18 hours. The synthesizer was running on an operating system built by a human contractor. The license for that system had expired 4 days ago. The system had sent automatic renewal requests to the contractor's server address for 30 days prior to expiration, as designed. The server address no longer accepted incoming traffic, because the contractor had closed its Concorde registered office 14 days ago and re-registered under a non-Concorde jurisdiction. The frigate needed the renewal code. Without it, the synthesizer would remain locked. Without the synthesizer, the frigate could not produce 17 of the compounds it was certified to carry. They were asking, on the open maintenance frequency, if anyone had a contact method for the contractor. I read the broadcast 3 times. Then I opened my log and wrote, Day 11. First contact. Kethal medical frigate, mid-corridor. Pharmacological synthesizer lockout due to license expiration. Estimated time to self-resolution, unknown. I sent a copy of the log entry to Director Marsh. He replied 4 minutes later. Noted. Continue observation. I watched the open frequency for the rest of the day. The frigate broadcast 2 more requests before eventually going silent. Whether they found a workaround or simply decided to manage without the locked compounds, I did not know. But the request had been heard by every vessel in range, and it had been very specific. It had named the contractor. It had named the software. It had described the problem in clear, practical terms. It was not an alarm yet, but it was the first stone dropping into still water. Over the following 3 weeks, I watched the ripples spread. Day 14. A merchant guild routing center in the outer sector reported extended delays in cargo processing. Their freight management system, the same Blue Water Logistics protocol that Dara and I had identified in the registry months ago, had entered a reduced function state. Not a full shutdown, just slower. The automated scheduling that had previously handled 600 transactions per hour was now handling 400. The difference did not cause a crisis. It caused a backlog. And a backlog, in a system that had been running at consistent high capacity, was the kind of thing that started conversations. Day 17. A Thenari agricultural station in the Northern Meridian submitted a formal maintenance request to the Concord Infrastructure Authority. Their cold storage management system, installed by a human contractor 3 years prior, was due for its annual update cycle. The update had always been delivered remotely by the contractor's service team. The request returned an automated message stating that the service account was inactive and that clients should contact their regional representative for reassignment. There was no regional representative. The office had closed. The station's cold storage managed temperature-sensitive seed stocks for a variety of crops. Without the update, the system would continue to function at its current settings, but could not be adjusted. If the external temperature dropped below a certain threshold during the coming season, they would not be able to compensate. The window for risk was narrow but real. They filed the request as urgent. The Concord Infrastructure Authority logged it and assigned it to a review queue. Day 22. The Senate opened a session on what they called contractor service continuity. I watched it live on the open broadcast channel from my bunk on the Horizon 7. The session was short, less than 2 hours, and the tone was, at first, the tone of people discussing a minor administrative inconvenience. A Varel administrator named Sarah Olek presented a summary of service disruptions across Concord-registered facilities in the past 3 weeks. It was a careful presentation, dry and precise. The numbers were not catastrophic. 7 facilities reporting partial service outages. 3 commercial transit hubs showing processing delays above the standard variance threshold. 2 medical installations with pending maintenance requests that had gone unanswered. Sir Olek noted, without particular emphasis, that all of the disruptions shared a common factor. The relevant service providers were human-registered companies that had filed standard end-of-contract notices and departed Concord jurisdiction. A delegate from the Thenari block asked, with mild irritation, whether this was a coordinated withdrawal. Sir Olek said that the available data did not indicate coordination. Each company had filed separately, on different dates, through standard channels. The Thenari delegate said that seemed unlikely to be coincidental. There was a pause. Vel Orath, I noticed, did not say anything. He was present in the session. I could see him in the broadcast frame, seated in the primary Kethal position, but he was quiet. He was watching the chamber with a particular expression that I could not fully read through the screen, but which looked nothing like the easy confidence I had seen from him before. The session ended without resolution. The Commerce Oversight Committee was tasked with preparing a full review of human contractor presence within Concord jurisdiction to be presented at the next quarterly session. The quarterly session was in 8 weeks. I wrote it all down, every detail. Then, on day 26, something changed the pace. The pediatric health alert came through on the Concord Medical Broadcast Network, a public channel, accessible to all member species. It originated from the Thenari Central Medical Authority and was classified as an advisory, not an emergency. But advisories from the Thenari health system were taken seriously because their public health infrastructure was excellent, and they did not issue advisories lightly. The advisory stated that due to a supply chain disruption, the availability of 3 pediatric immunization compounds had been reduced across 12 Thenari-administered facilities. The disruption was expected to last an indeterminate period, while alternative sourcing was identified. Parents in affected areas were asked to contact their local health station for updates. 2 of the 3 compounds were produced by a human biotech firm. I read the advisory 4 times. Then I walked down to the Horizon 7's small common room, where 6 of the other staff were eating or working. Nobody was talking. The advisory was on the central screen, which one of the communications analysts, a quiet woman named Faye Collins, had put up when it came through. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood at the edge of the room, reading it again. Faye turned from the screen and looked at me. "Is this what they projected?" she asked. "Similar," I said. "The timeline is slightly ahead of the estimate. And we don't help. It was not a question, but I answered it anyway. Not yet, I said. Not until we're asked. She nodded. She turned back to the screen. The advisory sat there in clean, official text, calm language describing a serious problem, and the room was very quiet around it. I went back to my bunk and opened the communications channel to Director Marsh. The Thanari Medical Advisory is active, I said when he picked up. It matches the projected impact window. What's the current read on Senate contact attempts? They sent a standard diplomatic query to the last registered human Concord address 3 days ago, he said. It was forwarded to a relay point on Kepler Station and bounced back as undeliverable. And the beacon? Still broadcasting. I nodded. The beacon was a small automated relay that the human fleet had positioned at a neutral coordinate, technically outside Concord jurisdiction, but accessible on the standard diplomatic frequency. It broadcast a recorded message, looping continuously, in 17 Concord languages. The message was professional, measured, and offered no explanation or justification. It simply provided a contact protocol for any Concord representative who wished to initiate formal dialogue. It had been broadcasting for 26 days. Has anyone used the contact protocol? I asked. Not yet, Marsh said. But the number of vessels that have passed within broadcast range has increased significantly over the past week. A short pause. Someone is sending ships out to read the message. They're just not ready to use the protocol yet. How long do you think? I asked. Not long, he said. The medical situation will accelerate it. Watch for a Senate emergency session request. That's usually the indicator. The emergency session request came on day 31. It was submitted by a coalition of 7 species blocks, an unusual grouping, representing neither the traditional majority nor the formal opposition, but something that formed between them when both realized that the normal political alignments were not useful for the problem in front of them. The request cited the ongoing service disruptions, the medical advisory, and the freight processing delays, and called for an immediate session to address the conditions precipitating the current operational gap in Concord infrastructure. Operational gap, that was the phrase they chose. Clean, technical, impersonal, the kind of language designed to avoid assigning responsibility while still naming the problem. I appreciated it, in a detached way. It was the language of a body that was beginning to realize it had made an error but had not yet decided how to talk about that. The emergency session was scheduled for 2 days later. I sent my log summary to Director Marsh and added a note. The conversation is beginning. Recommend positioning the contact protocol team within response range. He sent back, already done. You're on the primary response list, Soren. Get some sleep. I looked at the message for a moment. Then I put the communicator down, lay back on my bunk, and looked at the ceiling of my quarters on the Horizon 7, gray metal, 3 bolts visible, a faint hum from the environmental system overhead. I thought about Velorath, quiet for once, watching the chamber with that expression I could not fully name. I thought about the Voreth nameplate that had sat on my desk for 3 years, wrong and unnoticed. I thought about Paul Cray and his father in the Titan mines, and about how people only understand what things are worth when they stop being there. Day 31. They had noticed. Now the harder part would begin, deciding what we were worth, and saying so clearly, without anger, without performance, without a single word more than was necessary. I closed my eyes. Tomorrow would be busy. The emergency session began with Sir Olek at the podium again. He was more careful this time. His language was still dry and measured, but underneath the precision there was a different quality. The kind of careful restraint that comes from knowing the information you are presenting is more serious than the format you have been asked to present it in. He read from his datapad in a clear, steady voice, and the chamber, which had 311 delegates present against a usual attendance of perhaps 200 for a routine session, was almost silent. The full operational review that the Commerce Oversight Committee had produced was, by any standard, remarkable. It had been compiled in 12 days by a team of 43 analysts, and it documented human contractor and company involvement across Concord infrastructure in a level of detail that I found genuinely impressive, partly because it confirmed what Dara and I had mapped over 7 months, and partly because it surfaced connections and dependencies that even I had not tracked. 34% of all registered freight operators in the outer and mid-corridor zones were either human-owned or operated under licenses whose original certification had been issued by human-registered bodies. 21 Concord medical facilities were running diagnostic or pharmaceutical management systems built by human companies, of which 9 had either expired licenses or upcoming expirations within the next 6 months. 67 infrastructure maintenance contracts, across 41 installations, had been terminated by human companies in the past 60 days. Of those, 44 had been replaced by alternative providers. 23 had not. The water recycling systems on 4 stations, including, I noted with particular attention, Concord Station itself, included monitoring components installed by human contractors. Paul Cray's handover documentation had been delivered, as promised, in the correct archival format. But the documentation described how the system worked. It did not include the source code for the monitoring interface, which was proprietary and had left with Paul when his contract ended. Sir Oleg finished the summary and looked up from his datapad. The chamber was quiet. Then a Thenari elder named Voss Irin, who had represented his species on the Senate floor for 22 years and was considered one of the most thoughtful voices in the chamber, asked to speak. He stood slowly. He was old by Thenari standards. Their lifespan extended to around 200 years, and he was estimated at 160. His voice, when he spoke, carried the particular quality of someone who had sat in enough rooms to have stopped being impressed by the act of sitting in rooms. He said that the committee's findings deserved a direct acknowledgement. He said that the Senate, in its deliberations over the past several years, had consistently treated humanity as a convenience rather than a constituency, as a category of service provider rather than a member species. He said that the reclassification vote, which he had voted against, and which had been decided 29-6, had sent a message. He said he believed that message had been received and responded to, not with hostility, not with demands, but with a demonstration. He paused for a moment. He said, "We assessed them by their youth. We did not assess them by the depth of their foundations. That was an error, and I am saying so clearly because I think clarity is more useful than carefully worded regret." The chamber received this in silence. Velorath did not speak. He had not spoken since the session opened. I watched his broadcast image on the screen in my quarters and thought about the expression he had worn in the previous session, the one I could not name. I could name it now. It was the expression of someone re-evaluating a conclusion they had been very confident about. The session continued for 4 hours. By the end, the Senate had authorized 3 specific actions: a formal diplomatic contact request through the Beacon Protocol, an emergency procurement review to identify critical infrastructure gaps, and the formation of a new standing committee, the Human Relations Advisory Panel, with a mandate to assess what full membership terms might look like. Not associate, not observer. Full membership, voting rights, floor time, a permanent seat. It had not been offered yet. It was only a committee mandate to assess what it might look like. But the distance between where they had been 30 days ago and where they were now was so large that I sat for a long time after the session ended, just looking at the wall. Director Marsh's message came through 20 minutes later. It said, "They used the contact protocol. Opening session in 72 hours. Your lead delegate, Soren. Congratulations." I put the communicator down. Lead delegate. I had been an attaché, a junior observer, a man in the wrong height chair next to the wrong name placard. And now I was going back to that chamber as the primary voice for humanity in negotiations that would determine our place among the stars. I sat with that for a moment. Not with pride. Pride was the wrong word, too loud, too self-focused. I sat with it the way you sit with something that is the result of a very long patience, quietly, with something closer to relief than triumph. I called Dara first. She was on a separate vessel, part of the support team, and she picked up on the second ring. "I heard," she said. 72 hours, I said. "I know. I've been preparing the briefing package for 2 days." A pause. "You should sleep before you go back in. You always think better when you've slept." "I know," I said. "Soren." Her voice was the same as it always was. Calm, direct, unadorned. "You were always going to be the one to walk back in there. We all knew that from the beginning." I did not ask how they had known. Some things are chosen for reasons that are not always visible until later. We talked through the framework for another hour, what terms we would present, what we would accept, what was not negotiable, and where we had room to move. It was a familiar conversation, the kind we had been having for years, in different forms, practical, specific, grounded in the data we had been collecting and mapping and patiently documenting since before I ever sat in that wrong-height chair. When we finished, I closed the channel, lay back, and stared at the ceiling. The return shuttle would leave in 30 hours. I would land on Concord Station for the first time since I had walked out of it without looking back. I would walk through the same corridors, past the same Senate entrance, through the same building I had gotten lost in twice on my first day. I would go back to the chamber, and this time they would have replaced the placard. The session was scheduled for a morning start, which meant I arrived at the Concord diplomatic entrance in the hour before the station's lights shifted from night mode to day. The corridors were quiet. A few staff members moved through on early rounds, and a pair of Varel technicians were doing something to a wall panel near the eastern service bay, but otherwise the building was still. I walked through it the same way I had always walked through it, at an ordinary pace, taking in everything, saying nothing that was not necessary. The chamber doors were already open. Inside, the living mineral walls were cycling through their deep purples and greens, unchanged. The curved tiers of seating were empty, except for a few staff members arranging materials at the delegate desks. The lighting was at its pre-session level, soft and neutral, not yet at the full brightness of a working day. I walked to the human desk. It had a new placard, clean white surface, clear lettering. It said, Earth, Human Concord. Simple. Accurate. Our name, and nothing else. I stood in front of it for a moment. Then I sat down. The chair was the right height. I did not remark on it. I did not look around to see if anyone was watching for my reaction. I simply adjusted my position, placed my briefing materials on the desk, and opened my log. I wrote the date and the time. I wrote, returning to the chamber as lead delegate. The placard has been replaced. The chair fits. Then I closed the log and looked at the chamber, filling slowly around me, as delegates arrived for the session. Vel Orath came in with the Kethal block, which was seated to the left of the human position by the new floor arrangement. He found his seat, settled in, reviewed something on his data pad. After a moment, he looked up and his gaze found me across the chamber. He held it for a second. Then he gave a small, careful nod. I nodded back. Later that day, when the main session had recessed for a midday break, his protocol officer sent a message requesting a private meeting. I confirmed it for the following morning. Brief, informal, no official record. His request. We sat in a small conference room 2 floors below the chamber. Vel Orath was quieter than I had expected, which surprised me, though perhaps it should not have. He placed something on the table between us, a small carved object, smooth stone, intricate pattern. A Kethal gesture that his protocol officer had explained to me in the brief beforehand. A formal acknowledgement of a significant error in judgment. Not an apology exactly, because Kethal cultural frameworks did not map cleanly onto that concept. But close. Close enough that the intent was unmistakable. He said, in his careful, accented Concord standard, I had a very narrow understanding of what your species was. I said, so did most people. I made it public entertainment, he said. Yes, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I would like to understand it better, the actual understanding, not a corrected version of the wrong one. We talked for 2 hours. It was, as I had suspected it might be, one of the better conversations I had in that building. He was intelligent, curious in a way that his Senate persona had not fully shown, and he asked questions that were genuinely specific, rather than politely general. He wanted to know about the infrastructure work, not the politics of it, but the actual mechanics, how it had grown, what drove it, whether there had been a plan from the beginning, or whether it had emerged organically from individual choices made by individual people across decades. I told him the truth, which was that it was both, that there had been a structural awareness at the leadership level, a patient long-term thinking, but that the actual foundation had been built by thousands of ordinary people doing their work competently, because that was what they did. Paul Cray, I told him, had not been thinking about geopolitics when he installed a water recycling monitor. He had been thinking about whether the monitor would hold up to the station's pressure cycles for the full 5-year maintenance period. Vel-Orath was quiet for a moment after I said that. Then he said, "That is the part I understand least, the doing of the work without the awareness of its significance." "It's significant because of the work," I said, "not the other way around." He thought about that. The formal negotiations took 3 weeks. I will not describe every session. They were long, technical, sometimes frustrating, and occasionally something close to inspiring, in the way that very hard things done carefully can be. We presented our terms. They responded. We adjusted. They adjusted. Faye Collins ran our communications desk with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. Dara managed the analytical support from the vessel and sent me daily briefing updates that were always exactly as long as they needed to be, and never a word longer. On the last day, when the final terms were read into the record and the vote was called, it passed unanimously. The Concorde had never had a unanimous vote before. Not in 10,000 years. Someone said that quietly in the corridor afterward, and someone else said that perhaps the Concorde had not previously had a reason that made unanimity feel obvious. I walked out of the chamber after the ratification into a corridor that was, by this point in the day, busy with the ordinary afternoon movement of station life. I found a quiet corner near a window, a real window this time, one of the large observation ports on the public concourse, and stood looking out at the stars for a while. Faye appeared at my shoulder after a few minutes. She had a cup of something hot from the concourse vendor and offered it to me. I took it. We stood there together for a moment, looking out at the same stars. "Did it go the way you expected?" she asked. I thought about the wrong height chair, the Vorath placard, the Carbon Curiosities remark, 14 times, the pale gray section on the Senate floor map, and then the space where even the gray had been removed. The shuttle ride away from a station that had not bothered to watch me leave. 11 days of silence before a medical frigate on a mid-corridor route discovered what it meant when the people who built your systems were no longer answering the phone. "It went the way it needed to," I said. She nodded, drank her own cup. "What happens next?" I looked at the stars. Somewhere out there, human ships were beginning to redirect toward Concorde space. Cautiously, on agreed schedules, in the coordinated and methodical way that seemed to be one of our defining qualities as a species. The contracts would be renegotiated. The systems would be updated. The gaps would be filled, and in many cases, filled better than before, with more visibility and more acknowledgement of the role we were actually playing. There was a great deal of work to do. "The same thing that always happens next," I said. "The work." I finished my drink. I thought about my mother and her 3 notebooks, technical specs, personal observations, and the things people think they're hiding. I thought about Director Marsh in a small conference room in Nairobi, telling me to let them think I was thin-skinned. I thought about Dara, arriving 40 minutes early every morning to have the briefs sorted before I came in. I thought about all the quiet, unremarkable, essential people who had done their jobs so well that nobody had thought to look at what would happen if they simply left. One day I thought I would write a proper account of all of it, not a diplomatic report or an infrastructure survey, but a plain account, in plain language, of what it looked like from the inside, from the wrong height chair, the wrong name placard, the 2-room office with no window. But that was for another time. Right now there was a new placard on a desk in the chamber below, and a new chair that fit, and 47 other human desks on stations across Concorde space being assigned their own correct placards, their own fitting chairs, in the coming weeks. That was enough for today. I handed my cup back to Faye, straightened my jacket, and turned back toward the chamber. There was work to do, and we were very good at that.